They called it the hollow light, and the first time it spoke I almost laughed it off as a trick of memory, until the second time it called my name with the voice of someone I had loved and buried. I arrived in the town when the sky was the color of wet pewter, the road flanked by skeletal trees and rows of houses hunched against the wind. The old keeper's cottage sat a short walk from the blunted stone tower, half swallowed by brambles and tangled ivy. Paint flaked from the shutters like dried skin. The glass in the windows sat like cataracts. The town itself smelled of diesel and wet rope, a tang of seaweed and something sweeter underneath, like rot sugar left too long in the rain. People kept their curtains drawn. Dogs watched me with the polite suspicion of animals that know to keep a distance from pain. I came back because of a letter, and because there is a thread between a person and their past that sometimes must be untangled. My father had been the keeper for 28 years. When the county decommissioned the light, they left his house and the tower to him, as if letting a man keep his ghosts would somehow make them lighter. He died in his chair, with the radio still warm beside him and the kettle on the stove faintly steaming. The coroner wrote down a cause of death that felt clinical to me and not true to what I found. His hands clenched as if holding something, nails bitten to white crescents, lips blue but smiling as if greeting someone. In his coat pocket, I found a photograph I did not know existed, my brother, small and solemn, standing on the rocks with the lighthouse burning in the background. My brother had been gone for nearly 20 years. The photograph could not be real. It became my first knot to untie. The first night the wind pressed itself against the cottage like a living thing. I kept the kettle on and read by the single lamp, listening to the old house settle into its complaints. Pipes whispering, the floorboards sighing like old men. At 2 in the morning I woke to the sound of the tower, a slow metallic thump, then a hollow lowing, like the throat of the sea itself. The sound threaded through my bones and carried with it, impossibly, a shape of light. Not the steady sweep of a modern beacon, but an inner viscous shine, like oil burning under glass. I told myself it was nothing. There is a flattering superstition that the dead return in signs and portent. I told myself my father had kept a radio playing at low volume, and that the wind made the tower's mechanics sing. I told myself the photograph explained everything or nothing, which was the same thing. But I could not sleep. When I pulled the curtains aside to look toward the tower, there was a glow submerged within the tower's core, not casting outward, but pooling inward, as if the light refused to leave. It made the stone around it look hollowed, like the rind of some enormous fruit. On the second night, it was my name it called. At first I thought it was the creak of the porch, a tree limb scratching the siding. The sound had the weight of air moving through thin spaces, but within it was shaped the syllables for my name, the same inflection my mother used when she wanted to make a joke out of something sad. I stood in the kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, and listened as the wind carried the name across the yard and through the walls of my own heart. "Emma," it said, almost tender. "Emma." It was impossible to stay inside the house after that. The neighbors' windows were yellow squares in the dark. The town was quiet in the way only towns with unspoken traditions are quiet. I walked toward the tower along a path of salt-glum shale, the sea a black sheet beyond the rocks. My sneakers left prints that the wind tried to smooth away. Every step took me deeper into a kind of remembering I had kept tightly coiled. The way my brother used to race me along this same spit of land, the sound of our laughter stringing like shells on a line. They said he had fallen, but no one had ever said which cliff, which wave, which second bent him from a boy into a rumor. The town had learned to point at the sea with folded lips. At the base of the tower, close enough that I could smell the faint chemical tang of old wiring and something floral that made my throat clench, For all the world like lilies and molasses, I found the door ajar. The hinges were ancient, flaking rust into the air like a bitter perfume. Inside was the narrow staircase wound around the tower's spine, and everywhere the smell of damp stone and something else, something sweet and decomposing that made my head swim. In the small pool of light from my phone, I saw scratches on the wall, not accidental, but purposeful thin slashes that told a story in a strange alphabet. Some had names, some had dates, some had little handprints pressed deep into the mortar as if by children who had tried to stop time with their palms. I climbed the steps, complained under my weight. Somewhere below, the sea hummed. Halfway up, the shape of light found me, a wash from the core that did not come from a bulb, but from the stone itself, where the mortar seemed to drink and muster a soft, pulse-like glow. My skin prickled. A memory broke across me like thin glass. My father teaching me to read the weather by the way fog clung to the tower, how he would say, "Light keeps its own counsel." When I reached the lantern room, the panes were fogged with salt. And something else. In the cracked center of the glass, a single bead of condensation held its place, and within it I saw, impossibly, the reflection of my brother's face turning toward me, smiling in a way I knew was not of his time. It was then the tower did something I had not believed towers could do. It told me a story, not in words, but in sequence of images pressed behind the glass. I saw my father, younger, pacing with a bottle in his hand, counting off nights on his knuckles. I saw him open a chest and take out a small metal object that hummed like a trapped insect. I saw him lower it into the stone, and the way a light like an afterthought began to throb inside the tower. I saw a group of men in oilskins standing on the rocks, pointing at the light with rituals that had a gravity I did not understand. I saw my brother, small and brave, reach out toward the glow like a moth. The last image cut like ice, my brother's hand dissolving into light, fingers fraying like thread into the hollow. My stomach dropped and I thought I would be sick. The lantern room was a trap of murmurs, the light's breath, my breath, the hiss of my blood. I backed away, and the tower let out a low, amused sound, like a whale's exhale. The stairway behind me had transformed. It spiraled not only upward but inward, folding like a snail's belly. For a moment, everything in me, all the rational scaffolding I had built for this trip, fell away. The tower had eaten parts of my past and arranged them into a sculpture that pointed, cruel and bright, at my own guilt. In the days that followed, the town's refusal to speak became its own language. At the diner, the coffee tasted like plaster and regret. At the hardware store, the proprietor's eyes slid away when I mentioned the photograph. A woman at the bank muttered that some things had to be left where they were. In the papers, I found a passing note, decades old. Keeper found dead. Investigators baffled by strange light phenomena. Family says nothing. The sentences never named the small sorrow that connected them, the way people in this town had for years traded offerings through the years to keep the hollow light from pushing outward, from calling too loudly. I tried to leave twice. Each attempt ended with the car's radio crackling and the voice of my father bleeding through a static that repeated over and over a simple sentence: "Do not look." The engine would die at the edge of town. The road would curve back toward the tower as if it had memory, as if it had legs. I learned to move slowly, to breathe in the cadence of the waves, to hold my eyes low so the beam could not find the shape of me. But the tower knows how to reckon with such precautions. It found ways to knock at the small doors of my life, a toy I had from childhood left on my pillow, the smell of my mother's cardigan rolled in a closet, the echo of my brother's voice on the voicemail time and time again, a child's laugh that turned into a scream in the minute between two breaths. One night, The sea like a predatory black cloth, I sat in my father's chair and opened the drawer where he kept his notebooks. He had been meticulous with words, an ordinary man who believed notes could stitch over the frayed places. His entries were at first banal, weather, oil changes, tide tables. Then, in a different hand that trembled, he wrote of a bargain made in fog and desperation. In his own voice, written in script that swooped like a gull, he documented the year the tins went silent, the year the townsfolk came with a cask of rum and a knife and swore a vote to the tower. "We promised it things," he wrote. "Not food, not light, but names, pieces of ourselves. It wanted something small and then larger, and then the cost became only the cost of not looking." The last entry had only 3 words. It spoke my name. You could spread the rest of his notes on oilcloth and make a map of trembling human bargaining. There, between the ledgerings of maintenance and the recipes for preserving fish, was a ledger of shame. It was not hunger that fed the hollow light, my father admitted, but attention, the focused, willing unblinking of the human eye. When someone looked into it fully, it did not illuminate, it absorbed, and in that absorption it learned to be likeness and lover and memory. People had given it pieces of themselves, names they'd rather lose than keep. Those offerings kept the light contained, kept it wanting, but not breaking the town open. And one summer, when storms were bad and the rationed supplies ran low, some among them thought to test the light's boundaries. A young man had been dared to stare into the lantern room. He did, and his eyes became a pair of faint stars behind glass. The town learned a lesson as old as superstition. You cannot feed a hunger and expect it to stay kind. I remember the night my father first explained to me his rule. In the kitchen where the radio hummed and the kettle steamed, his breath smelling of tobacco and the salt of the sea. "Never look with longing, Em," he said. "Longing builds a bridge." I had laughed and called him an old fool, the way children call their parents fanciful. And perhaps that must have been how it began, with longing, with fingers reaching for something that reflected back an impossible version of a loved one, with the small, bright cheat of thinking if you could just bring them into the same light, you'd hold them forever. The next morning I woke with a new sort of courage, or perhaps nothing more than a numbness that had been stretched thin by nights of little sleep. I climbed the tower, this time not to peer into the lantern room, but to steal a look at the mechanism my father had used to keep his own small bargains. In the chest beneath the spiral bench was the object I had seen in the tower's memory, a copper amulet the size of a tin lid, stamped with an odd sigil and warmed by years of skin. My fingers knew this artifact without having known it before. For a moment, it felt like a thing that would warm me. The inscription seemed to move under my thumb, the grooves rearranging into something almost like a map. It was then I understood, as if understanding were a thing that could be held like a breath. The light did not merely take, it offered. It gave back scenes and apologies and voices that fit with a missing tooth of the heart. To stare was to be reassured. To stare was to become the merrier guest of one's own undoing. My father had not kept the light to cage it, but to keep its bargains limited. He had been, wonk and weary as he was, a guard consuming his own integrity to protect others. And in the end, he had failed because blood and lonely firmness are not always enough. I held the amulet, and for the briefest instant, I felt the tug of the tenderness it promised. The face of my brother smiling from behind a light that called like a cradle. I thought, I will not be the one to look. I will destroy this thing and stop the cycle. I crept down the steps with the stone pulsing blue-white through the walls like a heartbeat. Outside, the wind was a litany. There are many ways to begin the act of breaking a pattern. There are acts of violence that are loud and ceremonious, and there are acts that are small and secret. I set the amulet on the cliff's edge and struck it with a wedge we used to split wood. The metal canted and rebounded like a bird, and then split wide enough to reveal a dark, glassy interior that drank the cold. When it broke, the sound was not a crash, but the thin gasp of a thing being unstitched. The hollow light, if it was a thing, responded as things without patience do. The beam changed from an interior glow to a crucible of prying. It threw a focus like a needle through the air, and that focus landed on me. I didn't look in. I wouldn't. I had rehearsed the refusal like prayer. But refusal is an act that can be undone by the smallest of betrayals. The tilt of your head to see if the cruelty will relent, the tiny, involuntary hope that maybe this will be the exception. It was enough that I turned my face, even a fraction. The light found the corner of my eye and tasted it. For a moment I was everywhere, in my father's hands, on the rocks with my brother, back in the kitchen listening to the kettle sing. Someone laughed, and it was my mother's voice. Someone called my name, and it was the tower's amusement. The air folded. I felt the edges of me fray, like old rope. When I blinked, I was alone on the cliff. The amulet lay split into a black mirror. The tower's glow had calmed to an inner tremble, like a place breathing in sleep. The town slept, curtains tight. There was, at once, a heaviness and a startling transparency to everything. I could remember all that had happened with the detail of a photograph developed and hung on a line. My father's small offerings, the town's bargains, my brother's laugh like thrown stone. I wore those memories like a new layer of skin, and then, in the hollow place beneath the lighthouse where the light kept its counsel, I heard my name. It was not the tower that said it, not fully. It came from somewhere softer, as if a voice had been stored in the wall and polished for decades, awaiting the right ear. "Emma," it said, and the sound was not a plea or a demand. It was an offering, and it promised warmth. I realized, with a clarity that burned, that the hollow light needed not only the living, but the willing. It took names as others take harvests. It turned the hungry town into caretakers of something that was not their friend. My father had been right about many things, and wrong about the one that mattered. You cannot protect people from what they are willing to give away. The last thing I remember before the story loops, how memory has always been a circular thing in this place, is a mirror of my own face looking back at me from the broken amulet, smiling in a way I did not yet have the right to be. The light in the tower pulsed once, twice, as though pleased. The town's dogs settled down with contented sighs. A gull wheeled and then passed into silence as if swallowed by the sea. If you are listening to this, if you have ever stood where the land meets the dark and felt the ache of a memory you could not keep, do not give it what it asks for. Do not look straight into the hollow. Names are tender things. They do not like to be fed to strangers disguised as beacons. Perhaps I'm telling you this to warn you. Perhaps I am telling you this because the hollow light is a clever thing, and sometimes in the intervals between breaths, it borrows a voice to reassure the living. Sometimes, in the hours when the tide brings a suggestion of something enormous moving far beneath, I think I can still hear my brother laughing, distant and sweet. The town's windows draw their curtains more tightly, the sea keeps its dreadful symmetry, and the tower keeps its own counsel and waits for the next person who thinks they can save a thing by breaking its tokens. It waits with the patient hunger of a thing that knows time will always bring another heart that would rather hold a memory than let it rest.